Ever stop to think about the gas in your car? I mean, where does it really come from? Well, you might be surprised to hear that a lot of it starts its life as simple sand. It's pretty wild, right? So today, we're going to trace that incredible journey, all the way from a gritty raw material to the fuel that literally keeps our world moving. I know, it sounds almost impossible. How on earth does ordinary sand get turned into high-tech fuel? Well, that's the big question, and that's exactly what we're going to break down step by step. All right, so every journey has a starting point. And for this one, it's all about the raw material itself. Before we even get close to fuel, we've got to understand what we're working with here. And that is something called oil sands. So, first things first, you can just forget that classic image of liquid oil bubbling up from the ground. That's not what this is. Oil sands are, well, they're more like a really dense, saturated kind of earth. It's this messy mixture of sand, water, and clay, and it's all held together by a super heavy, super thick kind of crude oil. And that valuable stuff, the oil that's locked inside all that sand, that has a name. It's called bitumen. But here's the thing. It comes with a major challenge. It is incredibly thick and sticky. We're talking so thick that at normal temperatures, it just doesn't flow at all. And that right there is the very first big problem we have to solve. Okay, to really get a handle on this, think about honey that's been sitting in a cold cabinet. You know how slow and thick it is when you try to pour it? How it just sticks to everything? Now imagine taking that cold, thick honey and mixing it with a whole bunch of sand. That is basically what we're dealing with. It gives you a really good sense of the challenge here. So right away, the first big puzzle is pretty clear. How in the world do you get that valuable, sticky oil out of all that sand? This brings us to our next chapter, the Great Escape, or what the industry calls extraction. And it turns out there isn't just one way to do this. The method they use really depends on how deep the oil sands are buried. If the deposits are pretty shallow, close to the surface, the solution is basically just huge-scale mining. But for the stuff that's way deeper, well, for that, engineers had to get a lot more clever. So let's look at that first method, surface mining. And when I say it's a massive operation, I mean it. You've got these giant shovels scooping up tons of oil sand. Huge trucks then haul it all to a processing plant. And here's the key part. They basically wash the sand with hot water. It sounds simple, but it's super effective. It separates the bitumen, which then floats right to the top, ready to be skimmed off. Okay, but what about those really deep deposits where you just can't dig? Well, in that case, instead of bringing the sand up to the heat, you bring the heat down to the sand. They drill these special wells deep underground and inject steam. This heats everything up, and just like warming up cold butter, the bitumen melts and gets thin enough to flow. Then they can just pump the now liquid bitumen up to the surface through a second well. It's a really ingenious solution for sure. Okay, so success. We've managed to separate that sticky bitumen from the sand. But believe it or not, our journey is far from over. Now we've hit the next major hurdle. How do we actually move this stuff? And you might be thinking, wait a minute, what's the big deal? We have the oil and we have pipelines to move oil, right? So what's the problem? Well, the problem is this. Even after you've separated it, the bitumen cools down and goes right back to being incredibly thick. And trying to send that through a pipeline that's hundreds of kilometers long, it's literally like trying to push peanut butter through a very, very long straw. It's just not going to happen. So before this stuff can go anywhere, it needs to be treated. And there are two main ways to solve this whole thickness problem. One is called upgrading. This is a pretty complex process that basically breaks down the big, heavy oil molecules into smaller, lighter ones. This creates something called synthetic crude. The other option is a bit simpler. You just dilute it. You mix it with a much lighter liquid to thin it out, kind of like adding water to thick syrup so it'll pour. All right, now we're talking. The oil can finally flow. So it's ready for the next leg of the trip. This is where it gets into a huge network of pipelines and starts its long journey, sometimes for thousands of kilometers, on its way to a refinery. You can think of this part as the underground highway. These pipelines are really like the arteries of the whole energy industry. And along the way, powerful pumping stations act like a heart, constantly pushing the oil along, keeping it moving across those vast distances. And you better believe a system this important is monitored 24/7 to make sure everything is safe and sound. So after being dug up, separated, treated, and then transported all that way, the crude oil has finally reached its destination, the refinery. This is it, the final, most critical stage. This is where it goes through one last amazing transformation to become the products we all use every single day. So, what happens at the refinery? Well, the crude oil is heated up to really high temperatures inside a giant tower. The whole process is called fractional distillation, and the best way to think about it is like boiling a big pot of soup. Different parts of the soup will turn into steam at different temperatures, right? It's the same idea here. As the different oil vapors rise up the tower, they cool down and turn back into liquid at different levels. This lets you separate them out and collect them. And what comes out of this whole process is, honestly, the stuff that builds our modern world. The lightest liquids that they collect, that's the gasoline for our cars and the jet fuel for planes. The heavier ones become diesel for trucks. But it's not just fuel. This process also gives us the basic building blocks for countless other things, from all kinds of plastics to the very asphalt we drive on. Now, as you can imagine, a massive industrial process like this doesn't just happen without rules. It all operates under really strict regulations. These rules are there to protect the land and the water. They also push companies to constantly work on reducing emissions, and they require that any land that's used for mining has to be reclaimed and restored back to how it was. So when you step back and look at the whole thing, it's a pretty remarkable story. You start with this thick, sticky gunk locked inside of ordinary sand, and after this long journey of amazing engineering and chemical transformation, it becomes the very fuel that powers our lives. It's quite a trip. And that really wraps up this incredible journey. We've seen the complex process that turns sand into the fuel we rely on today, which of course leads us with one last big question to think about. What will the great energy journeys of the future look like? Thanks for following along with this explainer.